The governments have been so strident in their deployment of propaganda that I call psy-war or psyops or fifth generation warfare. This mantra, which is really a psyops campaign that's been deployed of saying these words, safe and effective, repeatedly.
COVID-19 vaccination is safe and effective.
Safe and effective.
I promise you, they are safe and effective.
That these are safe and effective products.
You called it NLP. You said that that is a way of brainwashing someone. We heard repeated over every single different media channel government, and that is a version of fifth generation psychological warfare.
When you heard those terms, you never heard any qualifiers. You never heard what is the criteria for being safe? What are the criteria for being effective? We now know there were no data suggesting or demonstrating that these products were effective at preventing infection or spread of the virus. We were given propaganda.
I know you were able to speak at Parliament. What was the purpose of that hearing?
SARS-CoV-2 was not a highly pathogenic virus. The 3.4% case fatality rate was basically a fraud. This has resulted in a major unnecessary loss of life from the dosing with these products.
Everything that we thought could go wrong is now going wrong.
Those of us who have been whistleblowers, we're being treated increasingly as enemies of the state, and people ought to wake up. The history of centralized authoritarian command economy governments has been very poor.
Local stance and commentary during the COVID crisis, particularly concerning testing, early treatment, and vaccine safety. Since then, you've written the best-selling book, Lies My Government Told Me and the Better Future Coming, where you explain the fifth-generation psychological warfare used by the deep state to bring about a new world order. On Monday, you gave expert testimony in the UK Parliament in support of MP Andrew Bridgen's proposed referendums bill, which he describes as a fight for the sovereignty and the integrity of the British people. Dr. Malone, welcome back to London Real.
Thanks, Brian. Great intro. Thanks a lot.
You've been busy. I want to hear about what happened on Monday and what didn't happen on Monday, because I know you were able to speak at Parliament. I know you were able to get a certain number of MPs and members of the House of Lords there, but I also know it was plagued with a few setbacks. And I'm sure neither one of us are conspiracy theorists, but some of them seem to be in the interest of not allowing you to get your message out there. Maybe you could zoom out a little bit and talk about why you were here, and maybe even bring people up to speed with what Andrew's doing in the Parliament.
What Andrew's doing in the Parliament is beyond, I can't wrap my head around that. He's busy in all fronts. He's got amazing energy, and his ability to state the case for whatever he's working on, I think is seriously excellent. He's just a super speaker, and full of humor, wit, and deep insight into the British system. What took place here was, as you'll recall, one of the last time I was here, I was speaking at the Carlton Club in support of Andrew to the Conservative Party, essentially. Andrew tells me that shortly thereafter he was no longer allowed to be a member of the club, and I reminded him that correlation does not prove causation. But in this case, we had a number of us were contacted by I don't know if he wants to be mentioned or not, so I'm going to hold his name. A citizen of the UK who lives in Cornwall, who's previously worked in the entertainment industry, particularly as an announcer and as an actor, and is politically active, and inquired whether or not we would be willing to come and participate in a protest and speak in Parliament on behalf of Andrew, given that he has been so censored, and the stories about the walkouts, etc., with the general population up in the balcony in the House of Commons, yelling and screaming and making noise behind that plastic barrier that they've set up now, or glass or whatever it is. It really went worldwide. It caught the attention of people in Australia, New Zealand, the United States, all over Europe. And so we were asked, myself and others, whether we would be willing to come and speak on his behalf at a hearing in Parliament. And there was a donor that stepped in that helped defray the travel expenses and provide some lodging. A very generous person that is very committed to our cause. But it was, we were asked to come out on a shoestring on short notice. And Andrew had arranged for a room that was quite a bit larger. And then that request was denied. And instead, a much smaller venue was authorized, I think about 50 people total. And then Andrew and Oracle Films submitted requests, and I think other press outlets also, to bring cameras to the event. And that was denied by the Sergeant at Arms, which I understand is pretty much unheard of. I don't know the nuances of British politics. So Andrew was quite adamant that we were going to get footage from this, even if they were going to try to block him. And so his own cameraman brought some gear, and that triggered the Sergeant at Arms to authorize security. And so the room, as you go in, had security officers flanking the entrance, which I'm told is also highly unusual. My understanding is about half to 2/3 of the people that had hoped to attend were not able to because of the size of the room. And all the cameras in the room, there were cameras in all 4 quadrants. And I understand that it's the norm that any testimony would be videotaped and archived. But in this case, the cameras were all turned off and no recording was allowed. Of course, there were a number of people in the audience that whipped out their iPhones and Android devices and captured video. So we have clips and some audio, not super high quality, from the testimonies. And for instance, my own, not that I'm, they were all excellent presentations, but mine went out as one of the first, and it's had 1.2 million plus views since Monday. And then it got capped for some reason, and no more views. So that's the status. And the cameraman that works for Andrew is busy aggregating and compiling and merging all of these video segments that were captured off of people's cell phones. And that should probably go live in the next 24 hours. There's been some clips put out by individuals such as myself. The hearing itself really went exceptionally well.
What was the purpose of that hearing? What did you want to accomplish, and what was actually said, if you had to summarize it?
So the intent was to reach, frankly, the persuadable middle in a situation in which Andrew is clearly being censored in every possible way, something you're very familiar with, and has been kicked out of his own party, although I understand there's been some inquiries about changing that. But Andrew has dug in that he is not going to back down in his positions in order to gain readmission into the elite. I guess he was a whip before. So the intent was to speak to the persuadable middle, speak to both the Lords and MPs, but particularly the MPs, to the extent that they're willing to listen, or those that are willing to listen, and provide scientific and technical information to them so that they might better understand that Andrew is not a fringe conspiracy theorist, or the various pejoratives that are thrown out by corporate media these days, but rather his positions and what he's been speaking about in House of Commons represents a valid scientific position, I won't say consensus, that is supported by bona fide physician and scientist experts, grounded in data. So that was the objective, was not to come in as bomb throwers or flamethrowers, accusing individuals of crimes against humanity or that kind of language, but rather to speak in moderate tones, but forcefully and clearly with data and documents to back up the positions, hoping that that might start to convince some fraction, particularly of Commons, to recognize that Andrew is not a fringe character promoting fringe theories. And my sense is that goal was achieved. We had 12 MPs and 4 members of the House of Lords attending, and they were very engaged. After all of the testimony, they asked questions. They were very active in asking questions. And one of the key messages that came through, we started with David Martin, again, reviewing the history of the coronavirus as a platform bioweapon for gain-of-function engineering, going back to really the founding of the WHO and the associated legal positions, such as the WHO having been indemnified by charter from the outset. He went all the way back to the time of the Rockefellers and their efforts to enable WHO and this whole global health agenda initiative, and built a case up to the present. And then we had Ryan Cole talking about the pathology that's being observed and the risks, disease types, adverse events. We had Pierre Corey telling the story of ivermectin and the collusion within the pharmaceutical industry to suppress repurposed drugs that were off patent in favor of licensed drugs, and the strategies that were used, in clinical research to delegitimize ivermectin in particular, because that's his focus. And I spoke about the more general aspects. I spoke extemporaneously, not off of slides, unlike the others, directly to the audience, which seemed to work pretty well in reaching people, about basically the underlying logic that this was not a highly pathogenic virus, that the 3.4% case fatality rate was basically a fraud. It was not supported by the data. In fact, the data have indicated that the case fatality rate for this virus, SARS-CoV-2, has been, in the end, more like 0.02%, which is the figure that Jay Bhattacharya came up with in his original studies at Stanford University in the first quarter of 2020. And of course, he was ridiculed for that, just like Trump was ridiculed for saying that it was well under 1%. How the 3.4% figure, which would mean that between 3 and 4 out of every 100 people infected would have died, and that would have been a true tragedy, no doubt. But that was used to justify the jamming of established regulatory processes and informed consent by patients. So I spoke kind of passionately about how we've breached fundamental principles of informed consent and agreed upon regulatory affairs principles for testing and demonstrating safety and effectiveness of vaccines. And then I also spoke about this controversy now that has come up regarding the New Zealand data that was released. And as you probably know, or your audience probably knows, the person in New Zealand that released the data was then arrested for having released those data concerning all-cause mortality and the correlation between taking the vaccine and adverse events, and is now at risk for, I think it's 7 years of prison for his role in releasing these data. So Steve Kirsch also spoke, and Steve has been very focused on this and the data analysis of those data, which has become quite controversial. And facing, all of this blew up in the 2 days before we had to testify. So I was asked by many to basically synthesize this and come out with my own position. And rather than diving into the circular firing squad of people saying, oh, you didn't do this, you didn't do that, you forgot this control, the data's missing this or the data's missing that, I made the point, both online and then in my testimony, that what we really need is for governments all over the world to release the data. And once we have the data, then we can argue about the analysis of those data, but we no longer have to argue, hopefully, about the integrity of the data, whether or not the data have been edited in some way, whether or not they've been selectively reported, so there's reporting bias, etc. So I spoke strongly about the logic that there has been a worldwide failure to follow established regulatory norms and established norms in bioethics and informed consent. I spoke a little bit about the role of the propaganda in blocking the ability of patients to have informed consent, but I spoke most strongly about the need to just have governments release the data. Then Steve came on and spoke at length because what had happened was that we had 2 recorded presentations, and somehow the audiovisual system wouldn't work, so we couldn't play those pre-records, and we couldn't have the audio working, and we couldn't get any AV support, and the controls on the television that was being used as the broadcast monitor were not there in the room. So again, the appearance that there was some sort of, at minimum, passive-aggressive behavior on the part of the sergeant-at-arms or his functionaries. And so the organizers were able to give Steve a little bit more time. And Steve spoke at length about the wrongs of imprisoning the gentleman who had released the data to him. The government of New Zealand has managed to reach in and have all of the servers that Steve had placed the data on so that other people could look at it and make their own analysis. Those servers were all taken down. Those files were all deleted at behest of the government of New Zealand. And Kevin McKernan, who's the gentleman that has been doing a lot of the genomic analysis to demonstrate the contamination of DNA fragments, had mirrored those data. And the government of New Zealand was able to get a warrant and have Kevin's servers cleaned out. So not just the data that he acquired from Steve, but all of his data were cleaned out in response to the warrant from New Zealand, which is a very strange position now that's being taken, really unprecedented. But Steve got up and really gave, I think, the best talk I've ever seen him give. And I've seen a number of them, going back at least 3 years now. But it was very measured, it was very balanced, and it was very focused on the same message that I developed the day before, whether he came to that independently or he saw my tweet and then decided to restructure his presentation, it went over very, very well, the emphasis on the need for governments to be open and transparent about the data. And then in the Q&A afterwards, we had a number of MPs basically endorsing that position and speaking in a very positive, engaged way. We had another MP who has a background in clinical research who strongly supported the presentation, series of presentations that have been made. His comment, as I recall, was that everything that he had heard sounded like standard good practice, good clinical practice that we were advocating for, which is really, if you were in my space, that's pretty much a ringing endorsement that we are all staying within the norms and standards of our discipline.
Why the UK? Why is that so important? I know you spoke about research that was done in Liverpool and Oxford, but why is this such an important nation to address when it comes to everything that happened during COVID?
Well, you have the Wellcome Trust, who has been intimately involved in I think the gentlest word I could use is collusion with Tony Fauci, Francis Collins, and the NIH.
Back to '02, I think, for the way Dr. Martin talks about it.
I would say probably earlier than that, but yeah, '02 for sure. So long history of collusion or cooperative ventures. We have this documented history now of engagement, joint engagement between the U.S. Intelligence Committee and MI5, MI6. I'm not sure where you draw the line anymore between those two. And then we've had the recent disclosures from Schellenberger that document that a lot of this censorship activity that I had originally attributed to the Trusted News Initiative really goes back a lot further, and it involves very high-level cooperative interactions between our joint militaries and our intelligence communities in acting to suppress this information and to suppress the ability of the public in both nation states to have access to adverse event information under the thesis that would cause vaccine hesitancy, and the belief system that we were going to have this extremely lethal virus and a vaccine that would be safe and effective. This mantra, which is really a PSYOPs campaign that's been deployed of saying these words, safe and effective, repeatedly.
You called it NLP during your testimony in Parliament.
Neuro-linguistic programming.
You said that is a way of brainwashing someone, safe and effective, that we heard repeated over every single different media channel, government. And that is a version of fifth generation psychological warfare.
Absolutely. And notice that for those of you that are able to hear this and are awake enough, when you heard those terms, safe and effective, you never heard any qualifiers. You never heard what is the criteria for being safe, what are the criteria for being effective. You just heard the words repeated again and again and again. Just like you heard the words that none of us are safe until all of us are safe, which was used to justify a lot of the mandate policies and the really PSYOPs that were deployed that to the under the thesis that if you didn't take the vaccine, then you were putting grandmother or whatever the surrogate is at risk. You're being selfish by not engaging in this, which we now know at the outset, there were no data suggesting or demonstrating that these products were effective at preventing infection or spread of the virus. We were given propaganda that we would be able to achieve herd immunity with these products without any data. And now with the passage of time, it's very clear that we could never get to herd immunity, no matter how high, how compliant the British or the American populace was, or the Canadian populace. And we now know unequivocally that they do not prevent infection and replication. And as was testified at the hearing, the data are indicating that the more of these products you take, the more likely you are to develop more severe disease. And increasingly, the data are showing you're more likely to die the more of these products you take, die from SARS-CoV-2. And that's a problem for the state. I think, Brian, really, and these are strong words, the behaviors we're seeing from nation states such as New Zealand, Canada, the UK, US government, and many others, Australian government, are indicative of those of us who have been whistleblowers or conscientious objectors, or you could use a lot of euphemisms. You could call us far-right neo-Nazi fascists if you want. But whatever we're being labeled as, we're being treated increasingly as enemies of the state. So now Ryan Cole and many of the others that traveled recently to speak in Eastern Europe about the safety of and effectiveness of these products are now being subjected to heightened security in their travels. They've been designated essentially with the same designation that people that are on the terror watch list have been designated because of speaking out about these things and just going over the scientific data. The behaviors are that we're being perceived as a threat to the state, which in one sense is amazing. I mean, just, a bunch of docs and scientists talking about medicine and science, but at another level, because the governments have been so strident in their deployment of propaganda, in the modern propaganda tools that I call Psy-war or Psyops or fifth generation warfare, they're really dug in. To disclose or confirm the nature of the damage that's been done through mandates, enticement, compulsion, coercion, in insisting that these products be taken up by people. It appears that the data are so compelling that this has resulted in a major unnecessary loss of life from the dosing with these products. 17
million is what you've said. That's a big number.
Yeah, whereas the prior, so this is Dennis Ranacort's group.
Okay.
Who from Canada, and they are absolutely being harassed by the government also.
And they said 17 million are dead because of the vaccine.
Right, that's their estimate. And this is a hardcore academic group. They're no longer in academia, but they are fully aligned with academic standards of biology scientists of various types and mathematicians and biostatisticians. So these are all PhD level people that are seasoned over a long period of time in analysis of all-cause mortality. Of course, you're familiar with Ed Dowd and his group in Portugal that have been collecting all-cause mortality data from a variety of sources, including insurance actuarial data. But Ed would be the first to admit that he is not an academic data analyst. Dennis Ranacourt and his group are very experienced in specifically all-cause mortality analysis. And he presented truly stunning data, I thought, at the 4th International COVID Summit that we just had in Bucharest. That's like 2 weeks ago. Right? It's all time compression right now. I've been traveling so much. In that, his group noted that the Karolinska Nobel Selection Committee, in their announcement regarding the award to Kariko and Weissman of Nobel Prize for enabling the rapid development of these vaccines through their invention or discovery, also mentioned that these products had saved 14 million lives. And they made a number of other statements, including that the reason, in part, that they were awarding this was to encourage people to take the vaccine. There's a number of statements made that I think are not defensible, but I don't want to come across as sour grapes, so I kind of don't talk about them much. I talked about them under questioning from people in podcasts right off after the moment. But so Rancourt and his group noted this 14 million lives saved number and tracked it down. It comes from a Lancet infectious disease paper that was published about, as I think, 6 months ago, or maybe as a year ago, this number. And this is peer-reviewed, published in a high-profile journal. Lancet is one of the top journals in the world in our space, medicine. So they decided to see if they could recreate the data, the calculations that led to this number. And what they found was that actually there was some fundamental mathematical flaws, very embarrassing, that it had passed through peer review and been published in the Lancet. But they're hardcore mathematicians. One of Rancourt's conclusions to his talk was that maybe we need to set up a super panel for peer review of mathematicians to fact check the biostatisticians and the epidemiologists after this fiasco. So they demonstrated that the calculations were wrong, fundamental mathematical errors, and when you perform them correctly, even using the data set that had been used for the Lancet, then you came up with no evidence of any lives saved, which is kind of aligns with the growing consensus. And then they took it a step further and said, well, we're experts in all-cause mortality analysis and have been doing this for years with documented data sets from all over the world, from countries all over the world. What do we find if we actually do the right analysis? And they found a number of unusual things that Dennis spoke about, such as the excess all-cause mortality that was observed during the COVID crisis under the various government policies like lockdowns, et cetera, had national boundaries. So there was big discrete differences in changes in all-cause mortality, which they can track on an almost monthly basis in a very sensitive way. They can detect the male mortality in the United States associated with the Vietnam War from the historic data, et cetera. They can detect excess all-cause mortality from earthquakes and tsunamis, and the data with the right filters, you can pull all this stuff out. And so what they found was major differences having to do with national boundaries, and even in the United States data, state boundaries. That included really refuting the positions that Gavin Newsom had taken about the state of California being superior to the state of Florida. Yeah. So they did this analysis, and what they came up with was worldwide excess of 17 million plus deaths in the all-cause mortality figure that they could attribute. This is their assertion. Once they had filtered out all the variables that they were taking account of, they came up with the 17 million excess deaths, and noted that that was the current snapshot, and that the trend lines in all-cause mortality, excess all-cause mortality, continued to go up. So they assert that we haven't peaked. It's still ongoing, and that may have to do with these more delayed effects. We are seeing unlike the propaganda that went out regarding the myocarditis, we are seeing significant mortality associated with the myocarditis. It's not mild and transient. That was another lie. They had no data to make those assertions. They were just trying to calm the public at the time, clearly, in pushing out those things. And we have these new ones that are really causing a lot of physicians to be concerned, the ones that are alert to the data and willing to speak out. And that's the cancers and autoimmune disease problems. And those are continuing to build. And that's why historically the accepted international consensus in vaccine development is that you need to do these large trials and then allow a follow-up period of at least a year, preferably 2 to 3 years, to see whether or not you have these delayed consequences emerging before you make a decision to license a product, particularly for such large-scale deployment.
Yeah. Everything that we thought could go wrong is now going wrong.
It seems like it.
In front of our face.
Yeah.
You've talked about future pandemics and this kind of new world order and the way that WHO is kind of positioning itself to kind of dominate nations. We've also seen a little pushback from some nations.
Yes.
What do people need to be aware of? Because if you walk around central London, COVID never happened, it's never going to happen again. Everyone's acting as if, it's not even on their mind. But what should people be aware of?
So to your point, what I'm hearing is very much aligned with what you just said. That here in the UK, the issue of the upcoming international health regulation modifications and the pandemic treaty with the World Health Organization is a non-issue here. It isn't being debated in Parliament. Andrew tells me that most parliamentarians have no idea about this. It's being treated as a treaty, but in the United States, they're bypassing the processes that would be required normally for a treaty, that being 2/3 positive vote in the Senate to affirm a treaty, by calling it an executive decision or something along those lines, and kind of getting it slid in under those terms. And I'm not an expert in the nuances of the timeline, which is really important. But there's a threshold right about now, or it might have already passed in December 1, for countries to comment and make decisions about the international health regulations. So why should you care? And why should you care? The answer is that these modified international health regulations that were originally developed by the United States Health and Human Services, so basically the same people that brought you the virus, have proposed a series of modifications aligned with the One Health initiative, which the underlying thesis is that everything, animal health, human health, climate, environment, all impact on human health, and so should all fall under World Health Organization, CEPI, and these large organizations that often get much of their funding from the Bill Gates pool of capital. Warren Buffett, I guess we'd call it the Buffett-Gates pool of capital these days. Under the modified international health regulations and the proposed new pandemic treaty, a couple of key things would happen. The WHO would double its budget. Nation states that are members of the WHO would be obligated to capitalize that doubling of the budget as a function of their current expenses in healthcare. Okay, something that, as I recall, Brexit had some things to say about the National Health Service and its budget, and now unilaterally you would be obligated as a nation state to further capitalize the World Health Organization, presumably at the expense of your existing NHS budget. I infer, I don't know, U.S. and the U.K. are both in this situation where the pot of money is pretty dry right now. I mean, we're increasingly finding it difficult in the States to sell Treasury bills. So I'm told. There would be an obligation to double the funding of the WHO, and there would be additional powers vested with the Director General of the WHO, the unelected, currently Mr. Tedros, who many assert is basically been put in place by the CCP and Bill Gates, and primarily answers to them. I understand his political philosophy is fundamentally communist, very much aligned with the CCP, an African man. And he would be vested with the power to declare global health emergencies for any cause. And the WHO, under these new amendments and modifications, would have the authority to have active surveillance, cynics might say spies, within member states to monitor for any potential public health crisis, and would have the authority to declare a public health crisis nationally or globally, much as he did with smallpox, with monkeypox. You'll recall that whole fiasco. Where the vote, I think, was 10 against and 6 or 8 for, and Mr. Tedros declared that a tie and then unilaterally decided that that was a global public health emergency, the outbreak of monkeypox, which turned out basically to be a nothing burger. So he would have that power, and he could declare a public health emergency for any cause. And relating to that, there have been over 200 scientific journals that have, in their editorial positions, taken the stand that climate change represents a global public health crisis. So the speculation that there might be a declared public health crisis for climate change or human-induced climate change is not just paranoid conspiracy talk. It's supported by the editorial positions of 200 medical journals. So, one would find one's nation in a position where the WHO would absolutely have the ability to infringe on national sovereignty in terms of policy and measures to be taken. For instance, I hear, just to build on this thread, maybe we have a public health crisis in the Ukraine because of the war, or choose your other hot spot in the world, along the Mediterranean or elsewhere. And we have refugees that represent a public health crisis. Well, maybe we have to have those refugees relocated to, say, Ireland.